The neighborhood looked calm to anyone passing by, the kind of Texas suburb where people cut their lawns on Saturdays and waved politely at one another from driveways. Children rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, and sprinklers clicked rhythmically against the sunburned grass. At the far end of the street stood the Miller house, a modest two-story home with white siding and a neat porch. Frank Miller often sat there in the evenings, uniform shirt still on, sipping a beer while pretending to watch the sunset. Neighbors saw only the outline of a dependable man, a decorated police officer, husband, and father. They believed he was the sort of person who held the community together. Few realized that behind the controlled exterior, his mind wandered into places he never allowed anyone else to see. Across the street, a new presence had settled in just weeks earlier. Maya Johnson moved into her grandmother's house, bringing with her a kind of freshness the neighborhood hadn't felt in a long time. She was 23, a nursing student balancing her studies with part-time work at a local clinic. Her grandmother's health had been declining, and Maya had returned to help, a decision rooted in loyalty and family love. To most, she appeared quiet, focused, and a little shy, often carrying books as she walked from her car to the front porch. She didn't know it yet, but her arrival marked the beginning of something that would ripple far beyond her own plans for the future. Frank noticed her almost immediately. At first, it was a glance from the porch, a casual observation that he told himself was harmless. Yet the more he saw of her, the way she brushed her hair back as she unlocked the door, the determination in her stride as she left early for class, the more his gaze lingered. The fascination grew, and with it came a restlessness that he couldn't explain to himself. He had spent years crafting an image of discipline and control, the officer who commanded respect, the father who set rules, the husband who maintained order. But inside, the sight of Maya stirred something that made all of that feel fragile. The community regarded Frank as untouchable, someone who lived by a different standard. His badge protected him, his reputation polished by years of service. People trusted him to keep the peace, even if whispers sometimes hinted at his rough edges. He had a way of letting his prejudice slip in subtle comments or careless remarks, yet most looked the other way. The uniform gave him authority, and the town wasn't quick to challenge that authority. It meant that when his attention shifted to Maya, no one thought to question it, at least not yet. For Maya, the move into her grandmother's house was meant to be temporary, a period of stability before she graduated and began her career. She had no idea that the man across the street was watching so closely, measuring her movements, and building a private world around her in his mind. On warm evenings, when she sat on the porch with her grandmother, she felt the comfort of home. But from across the street, Frank studied the small details she never realized anyone noticed. It was in those quiet moments that the story began, not with an act of violence, not with a public scandal, but with a silent obsession forming under the cover of suburban normalcy. Frank had built a career out of control. On patrol, he projected authority, the kind of presence that silenced a room the moment he walked in. To the department, he was the dependable one, the man who could be counted on to follow through with an arrest, to shut down a disturbance, to stand tall in front of the community. But beneath the polished exterior lived an unease he could never shake. He carried with him not just the weight of the badge, but also a bitterness that seeped into his private life. His views on race were no secret to those closest to him. He disguised his prejudice with offhand jokes, with smirks and half-whispered remarks, the kind of behavior that people either ignored or excused. It created an ugly contradiction inside him. He despised the very people he now found himself drawn toward. Maya's presence became a trigger for that contradiction. Each time Frank caught a glimpse of her, whether she was unloading groceries or jogging past his house, his chest tightened with something he refused to name. What started as idle watching soon turned into a deliberate pattern. He made reasons to walk across the street, offering help with small tasks like carrying boxes, pretending his concern was neighborly. She thanked him politely, believing it was simple kindness, unaware of the deeper currents behind his gestures. His wife saw little at first, dismissing his sudden interest in the new neighbor as nothing more than friendliness. But to Frank, every small encounter with Maya fed into a hidden hunger. The affair began in stolen moments, quiet exchanges that stretched longer than they should have, encounters that shifted from casual to intimate with startling speed. To Maya, he carried himself with confidence, the uniform lending him authority. At first, she mistook it for safety, a protective shield in a neighborhood where she felt new and unsettled. But soon the dynamic shifted. Frank grew possessive, showing up uninvited, leaving small traces of his presence that unsettled her even if she didn't want to admit it. What once felt flattering began to feel invasive. The duality of Frank's world deepened. By day, he wore the mask of a family man and officer of the law, respected by peers and feared by those he policed. By night, he crossed invisible lines, stepping into a private life that contradicted everything he claimed to stand for. He told himself he could keep the two lives separate, that no one would ever connect the man who smiled in his uniform to the man who lingered too long in his neighbor's living room. Yet inside, the conflict tore at him. His racism made him loathe the connection he had formed, and the shame twisted into anger. It was that anger, simmering beneath the surface, that began to shape his actions. The deeper he fell into the affair, the more his obsession revealed itself as dangerous. He wanted control, not companionship. He wanted possession, not partnership. Every interaction confirmed to him that he was walking a path from which he could not return. What had started as fascination was turning into something darker. And Frank, blinded by the thrill of secrecy, failed to see how quickly the lines of his life were unraveling. The longer the affair went on, the more cracks began to show in Frank's carefully constructed mask. Neighbors who once saw him as the reliable officer started noticing things they couldn't easily explain. His cruiser, which usually sat parked neatly in the driveway, was now often missing late at night, seen instead idling near Maya's house. Curtains twitched as people peeked out their windows, wondering why their neighborhood cop was spending so much time across the street. Some brushed it off as harmless, but others began to whisper, their trust in him shifting ever so slightly. Inside his own home, suspicion had already taken root. His wife, once used to the irregular hours of a police officer, began to sense patterns that didn't match the excuses he gave. Frank claimed to be covering extra shifts, yet she noticed how he avoided showing her his schedule. She found faint traces she couldn't ignore, his shirt carrying the smell of unfamiliar perfume, his phone guarded more closely than ever before. The late-night absences, the distracted silences at the dinner table, the way he snapped when questioned, all pointed to something larger than simple stress at work. For Maya, the shift was even more unsettling. In the beginning, she believed she had control over the situation, that she could end the relationship whenever she chose. But Frank's behavior made her realize otherwise. He grew increasingly controlling, demanding her time and attention, showing up without warning. His presence, once a mix of authority and allure, became suffocating. He questioned who she spoke to, where she went, even what she wore. She shared her growing unease with a close friend, confessing that she was afraid of how deeply his grip had tightened. Ending things no longer felt simple. It felt dangerous. Meanwhile, Frank's son picked up on fragments of conversations he was never meant to hear. Through thin walls, he caught words exchanged in hushed, heated tones, piecing together a story that alarmed him. He saw the tension in his mother's face, the way she avoided asking questions she already knew the answers to. Though still young, he understood more than his father gave him credit for. He knew something was unraveling in their household, something far bigger than a marital fight. The neighborhood itself became a stage for the unraveling. Maya, once known for her bright smile and polite greetings, seemed weighed down, her eyes avoiding contact as she hurried to her car. Neighbors who had welcomed her noticed the change, but they couldn't pinpoint why. At the same time, Frank's demeanor shifted from controlled confidence to thinly veiled agitation. He snapped at colleagues, grew reckless in his patrols, and carried a tension that bled into every interaction. The perfect image of Officer Miller was fracturing piece by piece. The danger lay not only in what people saw, but in what they chose to ignore. Everyone sensed something was wrong, yet no one dared confront the man who wore a badge. That silence allowed his obsession to grow unchecked, and for Maya, it meant the walls around her life were closing in faster than she could escape. The cracks were widening, and what had been hidden in secrecy was inching closer to a violent breaking point. The summer evening when Maya disappeared began like any other. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep orange as sprinklers hissed along the sidewalks. Neighbors went about their routines, unaware that something irreversible was unfolding only a few houses away. Maya had returned home from work, her car parked neatly by the curb. Her grandmother saw her come inside, tired but restless, pacing the small living room as if her thoughts were elsewhere. Hours later, the house was quiet. By morning, Maya was gone. At first, her absence stirred confusion more than alarm. Her car remained untouched outside, keys and wallet still in her bedroom. It looked as though she had simply vanished into thin air. Her grandmother called friends, then the police, her voice trembling as she repeated the same words. Maya wouldn't leave without telling someone. Officers arrived, treating the case as routine. Young women sometimes walked away, they explained, sometimes needed space. But those who knew Maya best rejected that idea immediately. She was responsible, deeply tied to both her family and her studies. Disappearing without a trace didn't fit. As the hours stretched into days, unease spread through the neighborhood. Whispers about Maya's secret connection to Frank began to surface. Some neighbors recalled seeing his cruiser near her house late at night. Others remembered the way he lingered at her doorstep, too familiar for a married man. His colleagues at the department were divided. A few defended him fiercely, pointing to his record and years of service, insisting that the gossip was nothing more than an attempt to smear a good cop. Yet others quietly admitted he had been acting strangely, his mood swinging unpredictably. His presence in the office tinged with paranoia. The case that began as a missing persons report quickly shifted when hikers stumbled upon a discovery that shocked the entire community. On the outskirts of town, hidden beneath the shade of twisted oaks, a shallow grave was uncovered. Inside lay only half of Maya's body, the rest never recovered. The condition of the remains suggested a rushed attempt to cover up a crime, careless in its execution, brutal in its reality. News spread fast, reaching every corner of the suburb. The young nursing student, once a quiet and hopeful presence, had become the center of a horrifying mystery. For the neighborhood, fear took hold. Parents kept their children indoors. Locks clicked earlier in the evenings, and conversations turned cautious, careful not to say too much, yet desperate to share suspicions. The shadow of violence hung heavy, and all eyes turned toward the man they once believed represented safety. The officer who had smiled from his porch, who had shaken hands at barbecues, was now at the center of a dark cloud no one could ignore. Investigators pressed forward, piecing together timelines, gathering fragments of testimony, and combing through the inconsistencies in Frank's story. Each revelation added weight to the growing suspicion, building momentum toward a truth that could no longer be hidden. The vanishing was no longer a mystery of absence. It was a brutal crime, and the evidence was slowly pulling the mask off the man responsible. The arrest came without warning, though many in the neighborhood felt it had been inevitable. Officers arrived at Frank's home before dawn, their vehicles blocking the cul-de-sac where children once played freely. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the man they had trusted for years was led away in handcuffs, his head lowered, his expression a mask of disbelief. For his wife and son, the image of him being placed in the back of a squad car was shattering, the final confirmation of what they had long feared but never dared to speak aloud. The man who wore a badge, the man who preached about honor and discipline, was now the accused. Investigators wasted no time presenting the evidence. Phone records placed Frank near the site of the shallow grave on the night Maya vanished, the digital footprint contradicting every alibi he had tried to craft. Surveillance footage showed his car leaving the neighborhood in the early hours, returning with mud clinging to the tires. His wife gave a statement about the night he disappeared from their home, describing the dirt on his boots and the smell of sweat and smoke that clung to him when he returned. Each piece of evidence was like a nail hammered into the coffin of his defense. The trial drew statewide attention, filling courtrooms with reporters, activists, and grieving family members. Maya's relatives sat through every session, their grief sharpened by the partial recovery of her remains. They would never have the closure of burying her whole, and that absence hung heavy in the air. The defense attempted to paint Frank as a victim of gossip and a target of overzealous investigators, but the weight of facts proved impossible to deny. Witnesses testified about his late-night visits, his temper, and his controlling behavior. Even his colleagues, once loyal, admitted under oath that they had seen changes in him, warning signs they had chosen to ignore. As testimony unfolded, the image of the decorated officer crumbled. The contradictions in his character, the prejudice, the obsession, the violence, were laid bare for the world to see. The jury listened as prosecutors described how he had manipulated his position of authority, how he had preyed on someone vulnerable, and how his obsession had spiraled into brutality. The courtroom fell silent when photographs of the burial site were shown, the stark reminder of a life cut short and discarded. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unforgiving. Guilty on all counts, the judge's sentence ensured that Frank would spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of the power and respect he had once wielded so easily. For the community, it was both a moment of justice and a wound that would never fully heal. The badge that had once symbolized safety was now tainted by betrayal, a reminder that even those sworn to protect could become the greatest threat. Maya's family never stopped mourning the pieces of her they lost, both physical and emotional. They carried the weight of unanswered questions, the torment of wondering what final moments she had endured. The neighborhood, too, was forever changed. The porch where Frank once sat now stood empty, the house a silent monument to a double life exposed. What began as a secret affair had ended in violence, leaving behind a legacy of fear, betrayal, and a truth that would echo long after the trial was over.